All right, let's talk about some proper punk rock. Not the polished stuff you hear on the radio these days, but the real, gritty, down and dirty noise that crawled out of the basements. We're going back to 1977 in a little town in New Jersey called Lodi. A bloke named Glenn Danzig had this idea. He wasn't interested in singing about politics or anarchy like us lot in London. Nah, he was into old horror films, B-movies, sci-fi, that sort of thing. He wanted to mix the energy of punk with the vibe of a late-night creature feature. It was a mad idea, but sometimes the mad ones are the best, ain't they? So, Glenn gets a couple of mates together. He's on vocals and the electric piano at first, which is a bit weird. I know, he gets a fella named Jerry Caiafa on bass. Jerry didn't even know how to play the thing at first. Glenn just told him to buy one and learn. That's proper punk, that is. They called him Jerry only. Then they got a drummer, Manny Martinez. That was the first lineup. They started bashing out tunes in a garage, making a racket. It wasn't quite the Misfits sound we all know yet, but the seed was planted. It was raw. It was simple. And it was all Glenn's vision. They didn't stick with that electric piano for long, thank Christ. It just wasn't loud enough, not aggressive enough for what they were becoming. They needed a guitar player to make some real noise. After a couple of early blokes came and went, they found Bobby Steele. And Jerry's younger brother, Doyle Wolfgang von Frankenstein, started hanging around. He was just a kid, but he was learning guitar from Glenn and Bobby. This is when the sound started to get heavier, faster. The horror movie themes were getting more in your face. They were becoming less of a garage band and more of a monster. The name, The Misfits, was perfect, wasn't it? They got it from Marilyn Monroe's last film. It just fit. They were a bunch of outcasts from a boring town, playing music that nobody else was playing. They didn't look like anyone else, and they sure as hell didn't sound like anyone else. This wasn't just a band. It was a gang, a club for all the weirdos. And at the center of it all was Glenn, writing these twisted little songs about zombies, aliens, and all sorts of ghoulish stuff. They were building their own little world, one 3-chord monster mash at a time. It was the start of something special, even if they didn't know it yet. You can't talk about the Misfits without talking about the look. It was just as important as the music, maybe even more so. In punk, your image is your armor, innit? It tells people who you are before you even play a note. While we were all ripping up t-shirts and sticking safety pins through our faces in London, these lads from Jersey were creating their own uniform. It was pure American horror. They took inspiration from old movie serials, comic books, and the rock and roll style of the 1950s. It was all black leather, tight jeans, and that iconic hairstyle. They called it the Devilock. It's that long bit of hair hanging down in your face, all slicked and pointed. Jerry only was the one who really made it famous. He'd stand there, bass slung low, with this black dagger of hair covering half his face. It was menacing, it was cool, and it was instantly recognizable. It became the haircut for their fans, the Fiend Club. You saw a kid with a Devilock, you knew they were one of you. It was a tribal marking. The whole band adopted it, making them look like this unified gang of ghouls who just stepped out of a UFO. And then there was the skull, the Crimson Ghost. They nicked that image from an old film serial from the 1940s. It became their logo, their mascot. They slapped it on everything, their records, their t-shirts, their drum kit. It was a stroke of genius. That skull is probably more famous than the band members themselves. You see that ghostly face, and you immediately think of the Misfits. It's like the Rolling Stones' tongue and lips, but 1,000 times more morbid. It perfectly captured the spooky, Pulp Fiction vibe of their music. It was marketing, sure, but it was cool as hell. Putting it all together, you had this unforgettable package. The name, the skull logo, the Devilock, the black clothes, the horror show makeup they'd sometimes wear. It was a complete aesthetic. They didn't just play horror punk, they horror punk. When they got on stage, it wasn't just a gig. It was a performance, a spectacle. They looked like creatures from one of Glenn's songs come to life. This strong, unified image is a massive reason why they stood out from the hundreds of other punk bands thrashing about at the time. They created a brand before bands even thought about branding. Success for the Misfits wasn't like it is for bands today. There was no internet, no social media. You couldn't just upload a track and go viral. They did it the old-fashioned way. They worked their arses off. They started their own record label, Plan 9, named after that rubbish Ed Wood film, Plan 9 from Outer Space. This DIY, do-it-yourself spirit was pure punk. They didn't want to wait for some big-shot record executive to discover them. They pressed their own singles, starting with Cough, Cool, in '77. They packed the records themselves, sold them at shows, and sent them to fanzines and college radio stations. Their reputation grew through word of mouth. They were notorious for their live shows, which were often chaotic and violent. They played fast, they played loud, and they didn't give a toss about what anyone thought. This attitude got them banned from a lot of clubs, which, funnily enough, only made them seem cooler to the kids who were into that sort of thing. Getting banned is a badge of honor in punk rock. It means you're doing something right. They toured relentlessly in a beat-up van, playing anywhere that would have them, from dingy clubs to people's basements. They were building their army, the Fiend Club, one town at a time. A big moment for them was when they toured the UK with The Damned in late '79. It was a total disaster, but it became part of their legend. They got into a scuffle with some skinheads, and Glenn and their guitarist at the time, Bobby Steele, ended up in Brixton prison for a couple of nights. The whole tour fell apart, but while he was locked up, Glenn wrote the song London Dungeon. So they turned a complete nightmare into one of their most classic tunes. That's the Misfits for you. That trip also exposed them to the UK punk scene, and they came back to the States even harder and faster. They never had a proper hit record. They never got played on mainstream radio, but their influence spread like a virus through the underground. Skaters started putting the Crimson Ghost Skull on their boards. Other punk bands started covering their songs. Their t-shirts were everywhere. You became a fan by being in on the secret. A mate would make you a cassette tape of Walk Among Us, or you'd see their logo scrawled on a bathroom wall. Their fame wasn't about chart positions. It was about cultural impact. They were becoming legends in the underground, a band that everyone knew about, even if they'd never heard a single song. Right, let's get into the nuts and bolts. The sound. The Misfits' sound was all about brute force. It wasn't subtle. It was like getting hit over the head with a plank of wood, but in a good way. A big part of that was the gear they used. Glenn wanted a thick, distorted, powerful guitar sound to back up his crooning about zombies and Martians. He didn't want fancy solos or technical wizardry. He wanted a wall of noise. The guitarists, from Bobby Steele to Doyle, had one job: play hard and play loud. It was all about the downstrokes, just hammering away at the strings. When Doyle joined the band, the sound got even more monstrous. He was this massive, muscular bloke, and he played the guitar like he was trying to break it. He famously built his own guitars, which he called Annihilators. They looked like something out of a sci-fi horror film, all jagged edges and custom pickups. He'd string them with really heavy gauge strings, which gave him that thick, chunky tone. He didn't care about finesse, he cared about power. His whole setup was designed to be as loud and aggressive as humanly possible, which perfectly matched the band's image and music. For amplification, they were all about Marshall stacks. Nothing says rock and roll like a wall of Marshalls, does it? They'd crank those things up to 11. The distortion didn't come from a load of fancy pedals, not in the early days. It came from turning a valve amp up so loud that it started to scream. It's a pure, raw kind of distortion. You combine that with Doyle's custom guitars and his aggressive playing style, and you get that signature Misfits guitar tone. It's buzzing, it's fuzzy, and it's got a real nasty bite to it. It's the sound of a chainsaw cutting through a coffin. And you can't forget Jerry Only's bass. He wasn't just hiding in the background. His bass sound was just as important as the guitar. He played with a pick, attacking the strings, which gave his sound a clanky, trebly edge that cut through the mix. He also customized his basses, calling them Devastators. Like Doyle's guitars, they were designed for visual impact and raw power. The combination of Doyle's Annihilator guitar and Jerry's Devastator bass, both blasting through overdriven amps, created this immense, impenetrable wall of sound. It was simple, effective, and utterly brutal. The Misfits' discography is a bit of a mess, which is honestly very punk rock of them. They released a load of singles and EPs during their main run, but only one proper studio album. That album was Walk Among Us, which came out in 1982. It's a stone-cold classic. It's got everything you Want from the Misfits' fast, catchy tunes, horror movie lyrics, and that raw, fuzzy production. Songs like Vampira, Skulls, and Astro Zombies are perfect little horror stories set to a punk rock beat. It's their definitive statement. It's the record you give to someone to explain what the Misfits are all about. Before Walk Among Us, they put out a string of brilliant EPs that are just as essential. There was Beware in 1980, and 3 Hits from Hell in 1981, which had London Dungeon on it. Another crucial one was the Horror Business EP from 1979. The title track is an absolute monster. These EPs were how most fans discovered their music. You'd hunt them down in independent record shops. They were like forbidden artifacts. Finding a copy of the Bullet EP with its controversial artwork of JFK was like finding a piece of treasure. Each one was a little blast of pure Misfits energy. They actually recorded another album before Walk Among Us, which was supposed to be called Static Age, but they couldn't find a label to release it at the time, so it sat on a shelf for years. It was finally released properly in the 90s as part of a box set. It's a bit more raw and has a slightly different feel, but it's packed with classic songs that they later re-recorded. Tunes like Last Caress, Attitude, and Hybrid Moments all came from those sessions. It's a fascinating look at the band at their absolute peak, even if nobody got to hear it back then. After the band split in 1983, their legend just grew and grew. A bunch of compilation albums started coming out, like Legacy of Brutality and the 2 collection albums. These records gathered up all the rare singles, unreleased tracks, and alternate takes. For a lot of fans who came along later, these compilations were their introduction to the band. They are treasure troves of horror punk gold. Songs like Die, Die My Darling, Where Eagles Dare, Halloween, and We Are 138 became anthems for generations of punks, metalheads, and misfits of all stripes. The body of work they left behind was short, sharp, and bloody brilliant. There's no two ways about it. Glenn Danzig was the man in charge. He was the creative force behind the classic Misfits. He wrote pretty much all the music and all the lyrics. The whole concept, the horror movie aesthetic, the look, the sound, it all came from his head. He had this singular, obsessive vision for what the band should be, and he was relentless in pursuing it. He was the director of this little horror movie, and the other band members were his cast of monsters. He controlled everything, from the songwriting to the artwork to the way the records were mixed. His songwriting was what made them so unique. He wasn't just shouting about being bored or angry. He was telling stories. He was a master of writing these incredibly catchy, memorable melodies and pairing them with lyrics about zombies, aliens, assassinations, and B-movie monsters. He had a real knack for it. He could take a title from a terrible old sci-fi film, like Astro Zombies, and turn it into a 2-minute punk rock masterpiece. His lyrics were dark and often silly, but he delivered them with this powerful, crooning voice that made you believe every word. He sounded like a cross between Elvis Presley and a demon. Danzig was a control freak, and that's both a good and a bad thing. It was good because it meant the band had a really strong, consistent identity. Everything was filtered through his vision, so it all felt like part of the same world. There were no weak links, no songs that didn't fit. But it was also bad because it created a lot of tension within the band. He ruled with an iron fist. He told the other members what to play and how to play it. By the end, Jerry and Doyle were getting fed up with being treated like session musicians instead of band members. This tension is ultimately what killed the band. After their final show on Halloween in 1983, Glenn announced to the crowd that it was their last gig. He'd had enough. He wanted to move on and do different things musically, and he couldn't do that within the strict formula he'd created for the Misfits. He broke up the band and took the songs with him, but you can't deny his contribution. Without Glenn Danzig, there are no Misfits. He was the songwriter, the singer, the leader, and the twisted genius who dreamed the whole thing up in the first place. A Misfits gig wasn't just a concert, it was an event, it was chaos. They were one of the most exciting and frankly dangerous live bands around. They brought an intensity to the stage that few could match. It started from the moment they walked out, looking like they just crawled out of a grave. with their devilocks and black leather. Doyle, in particular, was a terrifying presence. He was just this huge, menacing figure, thrashing his guitar around and staring down the audience. You didn't know if he was going to play a chord or jump into the crowd and start a fight. Their shows were short, fast, and brutal. They'd tear through 20 songs in 40 minutes, barely stopping for breath between tunes. Glenn would be stalking the stage, part rock and roll frontman, part coiled snake. Jerry would be a blur of motion, spinning and jumping while holding down the low end. It was pure, raw energy. The crowds were just as wild. The slam dancing was vicious. People would be flying everywhere. It was a release for all the kids who felt like outcasts. For that 40 minutes, they were part of the Fiend Club, and they could let all their aggression out. They didn't have big TV appearances to promote them. They did it the hard way, on the road. One of their most famous gigs was at Maxwell's in Hoboken, New Jersey. It was their home turf, and the place was always packed with their most hardcore fans. The footage from those shows is legendary. It's sweaty, claustrophobic, and violent. It captures the essence of the band perfectly. Another key moment was their Halloween show in 1983 at the Greystone Hall in Detroit. It turned out to be their final show with Danzig. It was a fitting end, going out on their favorite holiday in a blaze of chaotic glory. The Misfits' live reputation was built on this unpredictability. You never knew what was going to happen. Fights would break out, gear would get broken, the band might storm off stage, but that was part of the appeal. It felt real and dangerous, not like some polished professional rock show. They weren't there to entertain you in the traditional sense. They were there to confront you. Their tours across America in their beat-up van, playing to small but rabid crowds, are the stuff of punk rock legend. That's how they earned their stripes and built the devoted following that still exists today. The Misfits might not have been a household name in their time, but their shadow looms large over music today. You can hear their influence everywhere, especially in punk and metal. They basically invented a whole genre, horror punk. Bands like AFI, Tiger Army, and Alkaline Trio owe a massive debt to them. They took that mix of catchy pop-like melodies and dark, spooky subject matter and ran with it. They also copied the whole aesthetic, the whoa-whoa backing vocals, and the gang mentality. The Misfits provided the blueprint for that entire scene. It's not just punk bands either. A load of massive metal bands are huge Misfits fans. Metallica are probably the biggest. They covered Last Caress and Green Hell on their garage days. EP back in the 80s. That introduced the Misfits to a whole new generation of metalheads who might never have heard of them otherwise. Hearing James Hetfield snarl, "I got something to say," made thousands of kids go and find out who wrote that song. Other metal giants like Pantera and Slayer have also cited them as an influence. The Misfits' heavy driving riffs were a clear precursor to thrash metal. The influence goes beyond just the music. It's in the fashion, the attitude, the whole DIY culture. That crimson ghost skull is one of the most iconic logos in rock history. You see it on t-shirts, patches, and tattoos all over the world, worn by people who might not even be massive fans of the music. It's become a symbol of rebellion, of being an outsider. It's a badge of honor for Misfits everywhere, which is exactly what the band was all about. They created a culture around themselves that has outlasted the band itself. Even today, in 2026, you've got current artists name-checking them. You hear echoes of their sound in the music of bands like Ice Nine Kills, who mix metalcore with a love of horror films. You see their style in the aesthetic of artists like Billie Eilish, with her blend of dark imagery and pop sensibility. The Misfits proved that you could be dark and heavy, but also catchy and fun. They showed that you could build your own world and invite people into it. That's a powerful lesson, and it's why new bands and artists keep discovering them and falling in love with their twisted little songs. So, what happened after that final Halloween show in 1983? The Misfits were dead, but the members weren't. Glenn Danzig immediately started a new band called Samhain. It was darker and more metallic than the Misfits, but it still had that gothy, horror vibe. After a few years, he formed the band Danzig, which had a huge hit with the song Mother. He's been making music ever since, a proper rock and roll survivor. He's had a long and successful career, but for many, he'll always be the guy who wrote all those classic Misfits tunes. The other lads, Jerry Only and his brother Doyle, were left in a bit of a pickle. Glenn owned the rights to the name and the songs. For years, they couldn't do anything. They worked regular jobs. But in the mid-90s, they finally won a legal battle with Glenn that allowed them to reform the Misfits and tour under the name. They got a new singer, a fella named Mikhail Graves, and a new drummer, and hit the road. They released a couple of albums like American Psycho and Famous Monsters. It was a different band for sure, more metal sounding, but they kept the horror theme and the look alive for a new generation. That version of the band eventually fell apart too. Doyle left and started his own band, called Doyle, which is heavy as hell. He's still a massive, scary-looking bloke who makes brutal music. Jerry only kept the Misfits going, even taking over on lead vocals himself for a while. It's been his life's work to keep the brand alive. For a long time, it seemed like the original guys would never play together again. There was too much bad blood, too many arguments over money and credit. The fans had given up hope of ever seeing the classic lineup, but then, the impossible happened. In 2016, Glenn, Jerry, and Doyle buried the hatchet and reformed as the original Misfits. They got Dave Lombardo from Slayer to play drums, which is just mental. They've been playing massive festivals and arena shows ever since. It's a bit strange seeing them play these huge venues considering they started in tiny, sweaty clubs. But the songs still hold up. They're still powerful. It just goes to show you, the music they created all those years ago in that Lodi garage is still relevant. The Misfits are dead. Long live the Misfits. They're still walking among us.